The 6 cruelest practices of Kim Jong-un revealed. In the darkest corners of North Korea, where fear and repression seem to be the only unbreakable laws, emerge stories of unimaginable cruelty that paint a terrifying portrait of Kim Jong-un's regime. However, amidst these shadows, some argue that Kim Jong-un is not the absolute villain the outside world perceives. Behind the brutal acts and ruthless policies lies a complex figure who, according to his defenders, strives to maintain the stability and sovereignty of a nation besieged by external enemies and internal betrayals. This duality in his leadership raises a disturbing question. Is Kim Jong-un a ruthless tyrant or a leader forced to make extreme decisions in the name of his people's survival? In the dark halls of power in Pyongyang, where sunlight barely penetrates, oppression weaves like a black shroud over the life of every citizen. Stories of cruelty under Kim Jong-un's regime are more than just tales. They are living testimonies of unimaginable horror. Among the most atrocious practices that echo in the damp walls of torture cells is the heartbreaking story of Lee. This brave defector, whose attempt at freedom became his death sentence, was captured and taken to a place where humanity is banished. His lips, once the source of his words of hope and dissent, were sewn shut with cold metallic wire. Each stitch, each pull of the thread through his skin was a cruel reminder of his failed quest for freedom. The agony of feeling his lips sealed, the voice that once challenged tyranny silenced so brutally, is just the beginning of his nightmare. He was not only physically mutilated but also forced to listen to deafening hymns of loyalty to the regime, a brainwashing symphony designed to strip him of his humanity to its very core. In the grim cells where Lee was imprisoned, time stands still. Days turn into weeks, and weeks into months of relentless torment. The wire piercing his lips not only causes physical pain, but also symbolizes the price of defying the supreme leader. His captors, sinister shadows in spotless uniforms, revel in every muffled groan and every look of despair in his empty eyes. Dehumanization is not just a goal, but a refined art that regime agents master with sadistic precision. In the starless nights of North Korea, the wails of the tortured mix with the icy wind that blows through empty alleys. Lee, now reduced to a specter of what he once was, finds company in the whispers of the condemned who share his fate. Darkness is his only friend, a silent witness to the injustices they suffer at the hands of the regime. Each day becomes a struggle to cling to sanity as reality warps between physical and psychological torture, a labyrinth from which there is no possible escape. In Kim Jong-un's North Korea, horror is not an exception but the relentless norm. Extreme cruelty practices like the one suffered by Lee are just the tip of the iceberg in a system designed to maintain power at the expense of freedom and human dignity. In the land where the word freedom is a forbidden whisper, each wire piercing a dissident's lips is a chilling reminder of the brutality awaiting those who dare to dream of something more than blind submission. The room of forgetfulness becomes a silent, ruthless prison for those who dare to challenge Kim Jong-un's relentless regime. A defector, whose bold steps toward freedom were intercepted by the vigilant shadows of the state, was dragged to a place where time stands still and despair grows like ivy on bare walls. Locked in a clandestine room with no windows or visible doors, only access through a hatch in the ceiling marks the sole link to the outside world. A world from which he has been banished. From the moment the hatch closed over him with a dull thud, darkness became his only companion. There is no natural light penetrating this secret dungeon, only the dim illumination of a weak lamp barely serving to distinguish the room's shadowy contours. The walls seem to close in around him, condemning him to a confined space where reality's boundaries blur, and the echoes of his own steps are lost in the void. Days fade into weeks, and weeks drag on like years in the overwhelming solitude of the room of forgetfulness. There is no food or water reaching his trembling hands, only the constant sensation of hunger twisting his insides and the thirst that dries his throat. Each breath becomes an agonizing effort in air tainted by fear and hopelessness, where desperate laments fade into sepulchral silence. In his concrete prison of oblivion, memories of his former life fade like smoke between his fingers. The faces of those he once loved blur in the dimness of his memory as his mind clings to every fleeting detail of a past that now seems more distant than the universe's confines. Each day becomes a battle against forgetting, against losing identity, and the constant threat of falling into madness. The Room of Forgetfulness is not just a physical prison, but also a twisted mirror reflecting the cruelty of the regime. It is a monument to man's capacity to inflict suffering, where the absence of humanity is palpable in every cold stone and every desperate heartbeat of the prisoner. Here, in this dark corner of the world, time stands still and hope fades, leaving only the echo of their laments as a silent witness to the relentless injustice that reigns over Kim Jong-un's land. The Dance of the Ghosts becomes a macabre representation of oppression and ruthless control under Kim Jong-un's regime. Those accused of treason, bound with rough ropes that cut the skin and weigh like lead chains, are dragged to a desolate space where the arid, dusty ground becomes the stage for their torment. Under the unyielding gaze of guards dressed in gray uniforms and impassive faces, they are forced to move in endless circles, like puppets manipulated by the invisible strings of absolute power. Each misstep, each sign of exhaustion or weakness is met with a cruel blow and public humiliation. The whips whistle through the air, and fists fall like hammers on flesh and bone, while cries of pain mix with the wind's whistle that carries the echo of injustice across the desolate plains. The ground stains with blood and tears, a mute witness to the physical and mental resistance that fades with each agonizing turn. For the participants of this infernal dance, fatigue becomes as relentless an enemy as their captors. The scorching sun burns their exposed bodies, and open wounds become painful maps of their suffering. But surrender is not an option. The dance becomes a test of endurance where every tense muscle and every ragged breath is an affirmation of their refusal to break under the pressure of imposed terror. In the distance, the shadows of regime buildings rise like monuments to cruelty and despotism. The dance continues unceasingly, the endless cycle of oppression and submission that defines the existence of those who dare to challenge the established order. The Dance of the Ghosts is not just a form of physical punishment, but also a constant reminder of the fragility of freedom in a world where blind loyalty to the supreme leader is the only acceptable currency. For those who survive the dance, returning to daily routine under the regime's shadow becomes even more daunting. Physical scars will heal over time, but the wounds in the soul and mind will remain as eternal testimonies to the senseless brutality that defines their lives. The Dance of the Ghosts persists as a vivid metaphor for the unequal struggle between the individual and the state, where human dignity vanishes before the limitless power of the oppressor. The Mirror of Truth stands as a psychological instrument of terror in the hands of Kim Jong-un's relentless regime. Dissidents, dragged into gray, sterile rooms where time seems to freeze in sepulchral silence, are confronted with their own reflection in mirrors that cover the walls like ominous screens. Forced to look at themselves for endless hours, every facial feature becomes a map of the fears and failures lying deep within their consciousness. The interrogators, faceless shadows with cold eyes and voices that whisper accusations like sharp blades, surround the prisoners. Every word falls like a drop of acid on their bare skin, while threats of reprisals against their loved ones intertwine with the mist of uncertainty. Forced to question their own identity and loyalty, every heartbeat becomes a deafening echo in the icy void of the room, where truth becomes a negotiable commodity and lies the only lifeline. Minutes stretch like hours, and hours fade into days where the line between reality and fiction blurs. The reflections in the mirrors return empty, anguished gazes, while memories of a life before interrogation fade like ghostly images in the mist of time. Every word, every gesture is scrutinized with surgical precision by the state's unyielding eyes, searching for any sign of weakness that can be exploited to bend the prisoner's will to the point of total submission. In the Mirror of Truth, the past becomes a heavy burden on the accused's shoulders, while the future stretches like a bottomless abyss before them. Guilt and innocence intertwine in a deadly dance where truth is shaped by those who wield supreme power. Confessions extracted under the pressure of the mirror become bargaining chips in a twisted game of domination and submission, where the only escape seems to be complete surrender to the regime's demands. For those facing the mirror of truth, torment does not end with the interrogation session. Each time they look in a mirror after that moment, they see the cold eyes of their captors reflected in their own, reminding them that freedom is an illusion and truth, a tool manipulated by those who control the shadows. The Song of Silence becomes a twisted symphony of submission and despair in the dark corridors of detention centers under Kim Jong-un's regime. Those labeled as traitors are dragged, with heavy chains that drag like invisible shackles, into a space devoid of light and hope. Chained in rows like pieces of a macabre chess game, they are placed in front of an austere stage where the walls drip with the echo of their fears and whispers of condemnation. The hymns of praise to the regime, extolling the greatness of the supreme leader and the glorious homeland, resonate like a hypnotic mantra among the prisoners. Every word must be chanted with military precision, every note vibrating in the air like a sharp sword, threatening to cut the last thread of dignity they have left. The slightest deviation, the slightest hesitation in the imposed melody, triggers severe punishments that fall like guillotines on the bowed shoulders of the captives. The rough and dry throats, cracked by fear and lack of water, become instruments of forced obedience. The sound of their voices, a mix of forced compliance and silent despair, reverberates off walls eroded by time and brutality. The lost gazes, the empty eyes staring without seeing, are silent witnesses to the internal struggle between survival and the desire for freedom in a world where silence becomes the only acceptable currency. For the relentless guards watching from the shadows, the Song of Silence is more than a demonstration of loyalty. It is a tool of psychological control designed to break the human spirit's resistance and mold it into the form desired by the regime. Each repetition of the song becomes a ritualized act of submission, a ceremony where the chained bodies become dancing puppets on a dark stage, where freedom is only a distant echo, and fear becomes the only absolute truth. In the forgotten corners of the detention centers, time slips away like sand through the fingers of prisoners suffering in silence, where each note of the Song of Silence is a reminder of the unfathomable cruelty that permeates every corner of Kim Jong-un's land. The torture of silence is one of the most ruthless and dehumanizing practices of Kim Jong-un's regime, intended not only to punish the individual, but to destroy the family nucleus as an act of psychological terror. In a dark corner of Pyongyang, a family was dragged into an interrogation room, its members chained and forced to kneel on a cold, hopeless floor. The youngest son, known for his dissident opinions and his brave attempt to challenge the regime, became the center of this brutal lesson in obedience imposed by the state. The young man, his face marked by despair and fear, was immobilized while the regime's agents prepared the wire. Every movement, every preparation, was executed with meticulous precision that only increased the horror of what was to come. His lips, which had once spoken words of freedom and resistance, were cruelly sealed with rusty wire. Each stitch of the wire piercing his flesh was a blow not only to his body but to his spirit, silencing his voice in a calculated act of repression. The family forced to witness this atrocity had to watch as the young man writhed in pain, his muffled screams resonating in the air like a distant echo of the resistance he once showed. The faces of his parents and siblings were disfigured by suffering and helplessness, their silent tears falling on the cold floor as their hearts broke with each new, stifled scream. The room, permeated with the smell of fear and blood, became a chamber of despair, where humanity was eroded with each passing moment. The regime's agents, with cold and calculating looks, watched the scene with an indifference that only deepened the horror of the situation. For them, this was not just a punishment but a demonstration of absolute power, a clear message that any act of dissent would be met with unimaginable suffering. The torture of silence was not limited to the young man's physical pain. It extended to every family member, enveloping them in a shroud of terror and submission. In the days and weeks that followed, the family was released, but not before being warned of the consequences of any further acts of rebellion. The young man, with his lips permanently scarred by the wire, became a living reminder of the price of dissent. His eyes, once filled with fire and hope, now reflected the void of crushed resistance. The torture of silence, beyond its physical cruelty, had achieved its goal: to break the will of a family and sow fear in the hearts of those who still dreamed of freedom. The stories of cruelty and repression under Kim Jong-un's regime are as shocking as they are complex. From the brutal torture of silence to the chilling dance of the ghosts, each tale reveals a fragment of the intricate and dark mosaic that forms the reality in North Korea. However, behind each act of brutality, there are also unanswered questions and nuances that challenge the simplistic perception of the supreme leader as a mere ruthless tyrant. What truly drives Kim Jong-un? Is oppression a survival strategy in a hostile world, or is it simply a manifestation of absolute power? What do you think about this?